I told y'all we had to finish this. It was good. You hear me? I had to go do something, make some runs. And I said we was gonna come back and finish it up. So, back on this, go get what y'all need to get before we start. Y'all got 10 seconds. 10 seconds. Yeah, yeah. All right. Let's start it.
Continue to live freely. Melissa Tremblay was born on March 1st, 1977, in Lawrence, Massachusetts. When she was just a month old, her biological parents gave her up for adoption, and she was adopted by Jeanette and Robert Tremblay. Melissa grew up in the nearby town of Salem, New Hampshire. She was a
Why do I feel like her adopted? All right, before this start, I'm going to just guess it. I feel like her adopted parents did something with this one. That's what I think.
very energetic child who loved fashion, singing, and had a passion for reading from a young age. Melissa had many friends at school and spent a lot of time at the Boys and Girls Club of America. When she was 9, her adoptive parents divorced, and her father hasn't been involved in her life since. Sometime later, her mother started dating another man named Robert, but he didn't live with them. On September 11th, 1988, when she was 11, her mother took Melissa to Lawrence, where she was supposed to meet Robert. They often spent time at a local bar, and Jeanette frequently took Melissa along because she had no one to leave her with. Usually, her mom would let Melissa play outside since she got bored sitting with them. Jeanette always told her not to go far, so Melissa spent time on the nearby streets. Because her mom went to this bar quite often,
Bro, why is you letting your kids out of your sight? Go play. Just go play. Bruh, and then y'all out in public. Is there any other kids playing with the kids? And even then, an adult is gonna come up and just take another kid from a kid. Like, bruh, come on now, get it together.
Melissa made friends with other kids in the area and
When
would
you have
occasionally
kids,
play
be
with them.
responsible,
That
man.
day, Melissa spent
That's all
most
I'm
of her
saying.
time
Be
outside,
responsible.
checking in with her mother now and then. During one of these visits, the bartender made her some popcorn. Melissa said she'd come back for it soon and left, but she never returned to the bar.
Damn.
Around 4 p.m., her mother started to worry since Melissa had been gone for a while. She went outside and checked her car, but Melissa was nowhere to be found. She and Robert began searching for her, going street by street, but they couldn't find Melissa. They searched the area for several hours, and around 9 p.m., Jeanette decided to call the police. Officers immediately joined the search, but they also couldn't find any traces of her. By then, it was already dark. It made their task much more difficult, but the police continued searching for Melissa late into the night. They also considered the possibility that she might have run away, but her mother insisted that Melissa was afraid of the dark and didn't like being alone, so she would never have run off. The next day, Melissa's whereabouts were still unknown, and the search continued. This went on until about 3 p.m., when a railroad worker called the police. He had been conducting a routine inspection of an old rail yard just a few hundred yards from the bar. The yard was quite large, with up to 8 tracks in its widest section, although some of them hadn't been used in a long time. There were a lot of empty boxcars, and between 2 of them, the worker noticed something unusual. When he got closer, he realized it was a human body and immediately called the police. Detectives arrived at the scene and quickly identified the body as Melissa Tremblay. Aside from the fact that she had been reported missing since the previous morning, there was a card with her name from the
So they did this one overnight. The past ones that we've been watching, bro, they didn't find their bodies until like 20 plus years. So this one was like the next day type stuff they found.
The Boys
That's
and Girls
wild.
Club in a purse found near the body. Melissa's body was lying on tracks that were still in use, and one of her legs had been severed. The detectives believed this likely happened due to a passing train, since the section of track was still active.
Oh,
However, they
shit.
immediately doubted that this was the cause of death. The lead detective noticed several details that contradicted this theory. Melissa's purse, containing the card with her name, was found almost 20 yards from the body. This seemed strange, as it was unlikely that a train accident could have thrown the purse so far.
Right,
The
right.
detective also noticed a large number of footprints and drops of blood near the purse. This led him to suspect that Melissa might have been attacked there, and only then her body was moved to the tracks. The assailant might have hoped to make it look like she died in a train accident. Another factor pointing to foul play was the location itself. The old rail yard, with its numerous empty boxcars, was a known hangout for homeless individuals and those looking for secluded spots to use illegal substances. So the detectives considered the possibility that some of them might have attacked Melissa. Her body was sent to medical examiners, while the police began searching for clues. Since no useful evidence was found at the scene where Melissa was discovered, investigators focused on finding witnesses to piece together the timeline of events.
Damn.
First,
That's
they
sad,
spoke with an
man.
employee of the railroad company.
All this
He
stuff
mentioned
is
that the
just
day before the
messed
body
up.
was found, he saw a girl fitting Melissa's description near the tracks. He told her to leave immediately because it was unsafe for children to be there, and she left the area. Next, the police found a woman living not far from the bar. She said she had known Melissa for several months because her children had become friends with Melissa, and she often visited their house. On that day, Melissa had come over to invite her children to play, but the woman told her they were grounded and couldn't go out, so Melissa left alone. Investigators soon found another witness who provided the first significant lead. He reported seeing a girl resembling Melissa standing next to a van at an intersection near the rail yard, talking to the driver. The witness described this man as rather large, unkempt, around 30 years old, with dark hair and a large beard. The van was brown, old, and rusty.
Oh my
The police
God.
considered that this
Oh my gosh.
the van was
Bruh. It's always these type of like weird RVs, SUVs, or like old school SUVs doing some weird stuff, man. It was always that. Bruh.
was brown, old, and rusty. The police considered that this man might be connected to the murder and started searching for similar vehicles. Meanwhile, the medical examiners finished their report and confirmed that the train was not the cause of death. Melissa's body had numerous bruises and 3 fatal stab wounds. No signs of sexual assault were found, and there were no foreign biological samples on her body or clothing. The experts determined that the stab wounds were inflicted with the left hand, suggesting that the perpetrator was likely left-handed. The case was reclassified as a homicide, and detectives focused on finding the killer. However, they still had only one lead: the description of the van seen near Melissa shortly before she disappeared. The police concentrated on finding similar vehicles in the area, but repeatedly hit dead ends. The challenge was that even if they found the right van, linking its owner to the murder would be nearly impossible without a confession. DNA analysis was not yet in use, and there were no additional pieces of evidence, like Melissa's belongings or fingerprints.
When you write, your tone influences how readers respond. With Grammarly, just highlight your text and type how you
Likely to be found in the van. The police also kept trying to find new witnesses. They interviewed several hundred residents in the area, but this effort yielded no results. Detectives continued searching for the van and other clues for several months, but the case eventually went cold. Melissa's murder received significant media coverage, and many people began blaming her mother for what happened. They were outraged that Jeanette let her 11-year-old daughter wander the streets alone, especially near such a dangerous place as a rail yard. What infuriated them even more was that while Melissa roamed the streets for hours unattended, her mother was drinking in a bar. Rumors began spreading in the newspapers that Jeanette had developed a drinking problem after her divorce and was struggling with her parental responsibilities. People also started blaming social services for failing Melissa by not intervening in the situation. Amid all these accusations, Jeanette refused to speak with media or answer their questions. When reporters reached out to Child Protective Services, they stated they were aware of the family's complicated situation and had tried to take some measures, but revoking Jeanette's parental rights had never been considered. Since then, there had been no progress in the case. Police repeatedly reviewed it and examined potential suspects, but this yielded no results. In 2000, 12 years after the murder, investigators identified their first potential suspect, Tommy Lynn Sells. He confessed to 22 murders, and investigators in Melissa's case found that many details of his crime closely matched those of her murder. Moreover, Tommy resembled the van driver seen with the girl, and he often spent nights in empty boxcars while traveling across various states. Detectives began investigating his possible involvement in Melissa's murder, but they eventually concluded that he was unlikely to be responsible. They couldn't find any evidence placing Tommy near Lawrence at that time. Instead, they determined he was probably in another state. The case remained cold for several more years, until 2013, when detectives unexpectedly obtained a new lead. They arrested a man from Lawrence for an unrelated case, and during questioning, he suddenly claimed to know some details about Melissa Tremblay's murder. The man said that in 1988, when he was just 13, he used to steal cars for a living. He spent a lot of time on the streets looking for suitable vehicles, and on the day Melissa disappeared, he saw a girl resembling her. She was sitting on the steps of that same bar, and next to her was a man named Mike. The witness knew Mike, but his family had warned him to stay away from that man because of his questionable reputation. The boy walked past them, and about 10 minutes later, on his way back, he saw the girl leaving the bar with Mike. At some point, another man, whom the witness didn't recognize, approached them, and the three of them continued walking together. The police asked the witness why he had remained silent for 25 years. He replied that at the time, he didn't want any unnecessary contact with the police. However, when he learned about Melissa's murder and realized he might have seen her, he asked his brother if he should tell someone, but he advised him to stay quiet. However, the detectives immediately found a serious contradiction in the story. According to the witness, he saw the girl on the bar steps when it was already dark outside, but Melissa was reported missing around 4 p.m. when it was still daylight. Given that all the bar patrons and staff were aware of her disappearance, and her mother had been searching for her for hours, the detectives found it highly unlikely that Melissa could have been right outside the bar without being noticed. The police considered the possibility that the witness had either seen a different girl or his account was inaccurate. Despite this, they investigated Mike for potential involvement, but made no progress. Nevertheless, the witness's story brought renewed attention to the old case, and in 2014, it was reopened. By then, DNA analysis was widely used, and the police hoped that experts could find some new clues by re-examining all the available evidence. They examined Melissa's clothing and other items, but found no foreign DNA. However, there was something else among the evidence: samples taken from under Melissa's nails, collected in case she had scratched her attacker. The experts analyzed these samples and indeed found traces of foreign skin, which were promptly sent to the lab. But there was a new problem. Experts were able to extract a DNA profile of an unknown male, but it was only partial. It wasn't enough to get a match in the database, but the investigators were determined not to give up. Sometime later, they reached out to a company specializing in genetic genealogy. The company analyzed the sample and began searching for potential matches in available databases. This was a challenging task because they had to work with a partial profile, which made it impossible to identify the person with absolute certainty. Nevertheless, through meticulous work, they managed to find a possible distant relative of the sample's owner in the databases. This led them to a specific family with the last name McClendon. Detectives began investigating the members of this family, trying to determine who might have committed the crime. This process took several years due to the primary challenge, the lack of a complete DNA profile to definitively prove the guilt of any family member. Therefore, investigators carefully examined who among them could have been in Lawrence in 1988, matched all the criteria like age, and so on. Eventually, they focused on two brothers, one of whom was Marvin McClendon. Marvin lived in Alabama, but investigators discovered that in the late 80s, he lived just 20 minutes away from Lawrence and worked as a carpenter. Digging into Marvin's past, they learned that he frequently visited a church located just a few hundred yards from the bar where Melissa was last seen. Marvin had also worked as a prison guard for about 30 years, but with breaks, one of which occurred in 1988. The intriguing findings didn't stop there. Police found that Marvin owned an old brown van during those years, which he used for work. Despite this, Marvin had no criminal record, aside from numerous traffic fines for not wearing a seatbelt. He had been married twice, but both wives had left him. He had 2 sons from his first marriage, but was not actively involved in their lives. Finally, Marvin was left-handed, unlike all his close male relatives. While detectives were investigating this suspect, Melissa's mother passed away in 2015 at the age of 70. She had struggled with a severe illness for a long time and never found out who killed her daughter. After gathering all the information on Marvin and checking his other relatives, detectives concluded that he was the most likely perpetrator. In 2021, they went to Alabama to question him about that time in the late 80s. Eventually, they brought up the murder of Melissa Tremblay, and Marvin claimed he had nothing to do with it. When told that DNA from one of his close relatives was found on the victim, Marvin suggested that the killer might be his brother. That same year, Marvin voluntarily provided his DNA sample, but experts still couldn't establish a complete match. The partial profile from under Melissa's nails only indicated that Marvin was either closely related to the killer or was the killer himself. However, investigators who had already examined all his close male relatives knew that none of them could have committed the crime, leaving Marvin as the prime suspect. They also understood that without a full DNA match, it would be extremely challenging for the prosecution to secure a conviction. As a result, they spent another year trying to find any additional clues.
See, this is
Detectives also checked Mike, the man whom the 13-year-old boy claimed to have seen with a girl resembling Melissa on the bar steps. After obtaining his DNA sample, experts determined that it didn't match the skin particles found under the victim's nails, ruling him out as a suspect. They visited Marvin several times, asking him various questions. In April 2022, they finally decided to
Ollie and Anna seem so perfect.
I knew they did something.
What people didn't know was she was screaming for help.
This marriage's not healthy anymore.
arrest him. Despite his continued claims of innocence, Marvin allegedly made a suspicious remark during his arrest. He told one of the officers, "At least I got to enjoy 20 years of my pension." Marvin, who was 74 years old at the time, was sent to jail awaiting trial. The judge had to place him under constant protection because other inmates quickly learned about his charges and the fact that he had worked as a prison guard. Without conclusive evidence, the prosecution relied on a process of elimination. DNA from someone in Marvin's family was found under the victim's nails, but none of his close relatives had the opportunity to commit the crime. As for distant relatives, a match with their DNA would be less evident, and experts could easily see the difference.
Why would the officer do that? Why would he do that? That's so wild. Some sick people out there, y'all. Telling y'all, pay attention. Be aware of your surroundings.
They also pointed out that in 1988, Marvin
not
frequently
even that,
visited a
just be
church
aware.
on the same street as the bar,
'Cause it can
owned
happen
a
in
similar van, and
good
matched the
neighborhood.
description given by a witness who saw a girl near his vehicle. The trial began in December 2022. Marvin's lawyer immediately focused on the lack of a complete DNA profile of the perpetrator, claiming that without it, his client's guilt couldn't be confirmed. The defense then called two experts. One was a forensic specialist who testified that, based on crime scene photos, she couldn't confirm that the killer was indeed left-handed. The other was a genetics expert who argued that a partial DNA match with one family doesn't rule out the possibility of it belonging to distant relatives, as any person can have hundreds or thousands of them. Marvin declined to testify in his defense, and by the end of December, the jury began their deliberations. It took them almost a week, and on December 27th, they reported being unable to reach a unanimous decision. Some jurors felt that without a complete DNA profile, they couldn't definitively convict Marvin, leading the judge to declare a mistrial. In early 2024, the prosecution announced plans for a retrial, set to begin on September 30th, 2024. Until then, Marvin will remain in jail. Considering that he is 76 years old now and suffering from multiple health issues, there's a possibility he might not survive until the end of the new trial. If the court fails to convict him again, Marvin could be released, leaving Melissa's murder unresolved, and we may never learn the truth.
That's messed up.
Tanya Van Cuylenborg was born on March 7th, 1969, in Victoria, Canada. She had loving parents and an older brother she was very close to. From a young age, Tanya loved animals and even considered becoming a veterinarian someday. She also wanted to travel and explore the world. In high school, she went to Paris with her best friend, and that trip made her dream of traveling even stronger. Shortly before graduating high school, when she was 18, Tanya met a boy named Jay Cook. They went to the same school, but Jay was 2 years older. They met through a mutual friend after he had graduated, and soon they began dating. Even though Tanya wanted to be a veterinarian, she decided to take some time before going to college so she could travel. After finishing high school, she got a job at a cafe to save money for these plans, and she also worked as a dog walker. Jay also didn't go to college after high school. Instead, he helped his father with their small family business installing heating systems. In November 1987, Jay's father received an order, but the local suppliers didn't have one of the key parts in stock. The nearest place to buy it was Seattle, in Washington state. Jay's father decided it would be quicker and cheaper to get the part himself, rather than order it for delivery. However, he was swamped with work and knew he couldn't fit the trip into his schedule. So, he asked his son to go to Seattle instead of him, and Jay agreed. Jay wanted to help his father with the business, but he was also excited for another reason. He decided to invite Tanya, knowing she would likely enjoy the trip. At that time, they had been dating for about 6 months, but their relationship wasn't very serious. Jay hoped that the trip would change that and bring them closer. As he expected, Tanya agreed right away. They planned to leave Victoria in the morning, reach Seattle by evening, and return the next day. Jay's father gave him his van and money to book a hotel room for the night. However, Jay and Tanya decided to save that money and just sleep in the van. Jay's father also gave him a check for $700 to buy the part and a few $100s for other expenses. Despite Seattle being relatively close to Victoria, the couple had to take 2 ferries, first to get into the US, and then to cross the bay near Seattle. On the morning of November 18th, the couple got into the van and headed to the first ferry, which would take them to Port Angeles. Their parents expected them to return home the next day in the afternoon, but Tanya and Jay never showed up. Their families began to worry almost immediately, knowing the ferry schedule and realizing that if the couple had taken the ferry, they should have been home by now. However, the parents considered the possibility that Tanya and Jay might have simply decided to explore and enjoy the beautiful sights along the way, causing them to miss the ferry in Port Angeles. As time passed and there was still no sign of them, Tanya's parents called Jay's parents. By the afternoon, they were seriously concerned that something bad had happened. Despite their worries, the family held on to hope that the couple had just decided to extend their trip and continued to wait. Jay and Tanya did not return home by the end of the day, and the next morning their parents went to the police station to file a missing persons report. However, the local police decided there wasn't enough reason to conduct a full search. Tanya was 18 and Jay was 20. There was no direct evidence that they had been harmed or were victims of a crime, so the police assumed the couple had just gone off on an adventure and told their parents to wait a few days. Naturally, they weren't satisfied with this response, but the officers refused to start the search. By that time, Tanya and Jay's parents were completely certain that they wouldn't have just decided to extend their trip for several days. Jay was supposed to do an important job for his father's business, and he had never been so irresponsible before. And if they had indeed decided to extend their trip, they would have at least called their families from a payphone, which were plentiful along their route. Eventually,
so these two couples, right? Well, this couple right here, they're young. They were supposed to take a ferry and go back, basically. You think y'all think they got taken? Or, you know, that's kind of...
Tanya's father decided to start the search on his own. First, he and Jay's parents found out that their children never picked up the part in Seattle. The supplier said he had waited for them for several hours, but no one showed up. Next, Tanya's father drove along the route to Seattle, but this didn't yield any results. He found no trace of Tanya, Jay, or their van. Undeterred, he contacted a private company and rented a helicopter with a pilot to survey the area along their route from the air. However, this also led to nothing. Most of the area was covered with dense forests, making it difficult to spot anything. After that, Tanya's father made flyers with information about their disappearance and went to Seattle to post them on the streets. This went on for several days. The families of the missing couple did everything they could to find them, and the local police department finally started taking the case seriously. However, they still believed that Tanya and Jay were just spending time together somewhere and would eventually come home. As a result, they only contacted their colleagues in Seattle, providing a description of the van and information about Tanya and Jay.
Let me show you how to block this ad. First, you're gonna click on this video, then you're gonna download Pi. It's an ad blocker that's
asking to notify them if anyone spotted them. On November 24th, 5 days after the disappearance, a man went for a walk in the woods near a small town about 90 miles north of Seattle. While walking along the road near an embankment leading into the forest, he noticed something unusual under a tree below. When he took a closer look, he realized it was a human body and immediately called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and discovered the body of a young woman. Her clothes were partially missing, hands were tied, and there was a gunshot wound on her head. Investigators quickly determined that the victim had been killed elsewhere, as there was almost no blood near the body. There was no ID on the victim, so the police checked the list of missing women in the area. They quickly concluded that the victim matched the description of Tanya van Cuylenborg and contacted her father. He went to the morgue and confirmed that the deceased was indeed his daughter. Detectives began their investigation, trying to establish all the details of what had happened. They learned that Tanya had been traveling with Jay, whose whereabouts were still unknown. Jay's van was also missing, leading investigators to consider his possible involvement. Jay's family refused to believe he could have done something like this. They insisted that he had never shown signs of aggression and that he loved Tanya. He also did not own a firearm and would not have been able to purchase one easily. While the police were trying to locate him, they got another call. A bartender from a town called Bellingham, about 18 miles from where the body was found, went outside and saw a wallet and keys on the ground. When he opened the wallet, he found an ID with the name Tanya van Cuylenborg. At first, he didn't call the police. Instead, he took everything back to the bar, thinking the owner might return for them. But after seeing a news report about Tanya's murder on TV, he immediately called 911. Detectives searched the area around the bar and found several plastic zip ties, identical to those used to bind Tanya's hands, under the back porch. They also discovered rubber gloves and a half-empty box of bullets. But that wasn't all. One of the officers noticed a van parked nearby, and the police quickly determined that it was the same vehicle Tanya and Jay had traveled in. Inside the van, there was utter chaos. Everything was scattered and broken, but investigators managed to find several important clues. There were numerous receipts that could help reconstruct Tanya and Jay's route, as well as a ferry ticket. This indicated that the couple had indeed made it to Seattle, and something horrible happened to them there. Detectives also noticed that Tanya's camera, which she had taken on the trip, was missing from the van. Since it wasn't found near her body either, they speculated that the killer might have taken it. The interior of the van was covered in blood. Forensic experts collected these samples and sent them to the lab, hoping that this evidence would bring them closer to solving the case. At that time, DNA analysis was just starting to be used in criminology, but it had already helped solve several cases. The lab in Seattle conducted the analysis and found 3 blood samples: Tanya's, Jay's, and an unknown man's. Since the FBI's DNA database did not exist yet, it was impossible to identify the third person without a direct comparison. Nevertheless, detectives realized that Jay was likely not involved in the murder and stopped considering him as the main suspect. They now faced other questions. Was he still alive? And where was he? Unfortunately, it didn't take long to find the answer. On November 26, a group of friends went hunting just a few dozen miles from Seattle. While walking near a bridge over a small river, they saw a human body in the bushes and reported it to the police. Investigators quickly identified the deceased as Jay Cook. His body showed numerous bruises, and the cause of death appeared to be strangulation. Given the brutality of this crime, detectives even considered that the perpetrator might have known Jay and had some personal motives. They also theorized that Jay had been killed first, since his body was found closer to Seattle. The perpetrator then drove Tanya in the van almost to the Canadian border, killed her, and left her body in a wooded area. Medical experts also found traces of semen on her body, and DNA analysis revealed that it belonged to the same man whose blood was found in the van. However, his identity remained unknown. At the same time, investigators were trying to reconstruct the couple's route, and the receipts found in the van helped them establish an approximate timeline. After Tanya and Jay took the ferry from Victoria to Port Angeles, they stopped at a store to buy some food. Then, they headed towards Seattle, but Jay apparently missed the turn for the shortest route. This was supported by a receipt from a store in the small town of Hoodsport and the testimony of the store clerk, who saw a young couple matching their description and remembered they asked for directions to the ferry crossing. The clerk also shared an interesting observation. She thought that a man in a brown raincoat was following the couple. He entered the store shortly after them and left right after they did, but she didn't see where the man went next. The next receipt showed detectives that Tanya and Jay had visited a store in the small town of Allen. After that, they reached the ferry near Seattle and bought a ticket. Several witnesses saw them near this location, but detectives couldn't track their movements beyond that point. Investigators began checking various individuals in Seattle who had previous convictions for violent crimes, trying to find suspects, but these efforts yielded no results. Despite having the killer's DNA, the police had no idea how to identify the perpetrator. They suspected this person had committed serious crimes before, as it was hard to believe an amateur could pull off such an elaborate crime. It seemed likely he had followed the couple for a while and managed to abduct them once they reached Seattle. Investigators thought he might have gained their trust by asking for a ride, and at some point used a gun to force them to comply with his demands. They also thought that the killer had deliberately left Tanya's belongings and the rubber gloves in a visible place to taunt the police. Perhaps the killer was trying to say that it was useless to search for his fingerprints since he wore gloves and they wouldn't be able to catch him. It's worth mentioning that forensic experts found several fingerprints on the van that did not belong to Tanya or Jay. However, the police doubted they belonged to the killer, given that he likely wore gloves. These prints were not in any databases, so they did not bring investigators any closer to catching the perpetrator. For the next few weeks, detectives continued to search for new leads or witnesses and checked various suspects, but none of these efforts yielded results. This continued until December, about a month after the murders, when something unexpected happened. Tanya and Jay's family started receiving letters and postcards from someone claiming to be the killer. In these messages, the sender confessed to the crimes, mocked the victims' families, and said the police would never catch him. Investigators tried to trace the sender, but this was extremely difficult in those days. All they could determine was which cities the letters were sent from, but this information did not help identify the perpetrator. The letters continued to arrive on a regular basis, often during holidays, which investigators believed was the sender's way of causing the families even more pain. Police also found that the letters were sent from different cities and states, indicating that the sender traveled around the country. However, they weren't entirely sure that the sender was the killer. In high-profile cases, it's not uncommon for people to torment the victims' families with fake letters claiming to be from the perpetrator. Unfortunately, fake letters from supposed perpetrators are a common thing. Since then, there was no significant progress in the case for many years. Detectives continued to investigate potential suspects and did not rule out the involvement of a serial killer. This theory was supported by the fact that 2 other couples had been abducted in the same part of the state in recent years, although the police found the connection between these cases tenuous. In the following years, investigators caught several serial killers operating in the area, but none were linked to the murders of Tanya and Jay. In 2003, the case was reopened, and detectives entered the perpetrator's DNA sample into the FBI database, but no matches were found. Despite this, they continued to believe that the perpetrator must have had a lengthy criminal history, but either had not been caught by the police or had been arrested before DNA sampling became mandatory. In 2010, something else happened. This case was featured on a popular national TV program, resulting in numerous fresh tips. One caller suggested that he might know the identity of the person who sent the letters to the victims' families. This lead pointed to a 78-year-old man from Seattle, and the police began investigating him. It turned out that this man had traveled extensively around the country during those years, and the location of his trips
So
matched
this
the
man
cities
traveled
from which the letters were
state
sent.
to state.
Detectives
just
concluded that
send
he was indeed the author of
letters
these
to his
letters,
family.
but
This
had
is
no
wild.
connection to the actual murders. This individual clearly suffered from severe mental health issues, and his DNA did not match the blood and semen samples from the crime scenes. This confirmed that the letters were written not by the real perpetrator, but by a completely unrelated person. The case remained cold for several more years. In 2018, detectives
so I
learned
didn't
about
even know. That
Parabon,
didn't even-
a company offering
The
to
killer.
create composite sketches of individuals
Right,
based
that's
on their
wild.
DNA samples. Given the lack of any
Trolls,
other
trolling
leads,
them.
investigators decided to try this method. Parabon experts created estimated sketches of the killer at different ages, and the police distributed these images to the media, hoping someone might recognize the man. However, it led nowhere. Despite this, the investigators refused to give up and decided to try another method, genetic genealogy. Parabon experts uploaded the killer's DNA sample to public databases and began searching for any distant relatives of the perpetrator. Soon, they identified a possible second cousin of the killer and started tracing her family tree. They were searching for a man who lived in Seattle or its vicinity in 1987 and matched all the criteria, including age. With the help of his cousin, they eventually identified their suspect, a 55-year-old man named William Talbot. He lived in a Seattle suburb and worked as a truck driver. Before they could arrest him, police needed to confirm that the killer's DNA matched his. They surveilled William for a couple of days and eventually retrieved a coffee cup he had discarded. The saliva sample from the cup provided a DNA profile that was a perfect match.
Oh,
In mid-May
shit.
2018, 30 years after the murders, investigators finally
30
arrested William.
years?
He denied any involvement, and the case went to court. The trial began in 2019, and the defense attorneys tried to challenge the primary evidence, the DNA. They argued that the semen on Tanya's body could have resulted from consensual intercourse. They also pointed out that the prosecution had no other evidence directly linking William to Jay's murder. However, the prosecutor had a strong counterargument. As we remember, back in 1987, experts found fingerprints on the van that did not match Tanya or Jay, nor did they match anyone in the database at the time. Now, experts compared these fingerprints to William's, and they were a match. Another crucial piece of evidence came from William's friend. He testified that he saw a brown van outside William's house in 1987, which clearly didn't belong to him. This suggested that William might have driven the van to his house, although it was unclear whether this was before or after the murders. William also lived only a few miles from where Jay's body was found, indicating he was familiar with the area. None of William's relatives attended the trial, but they did share quite a bit with the investigators. They described William as always being very aggressive, and other family members were genuinely afraid of him. Because of this, most had cut off contact with him after he had moved out. When they learned about the charges against him, none were surprised that William could have committed such crimes. The prosecution's theory was that William had asked Tanya and Jay for a ride to Seattle under some pretext. Once they arrived in the city at night, he used a gun to force them to drive to a remote area. He then killed them at different locations, discarded Tanya's belongings and the van in another town, and remained off the police radar for the next 30 years. Without a confession, it was impossible to establish more details, but with such substantial evidence, no one doubted William's guilt. The trial ended in June 2019, and William was found guilty of the double murder. He received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Notably, this was the first case where genetic genealogy led to a conviction. However, an unexpected problem arose after the trial. William's lawyers appealed the conviction, arguing that the jury had been biased against the defendant, which they claimed violated his constitutional rights and made the jurors unfit to serve. This led to a judge overturning the conviction in 2021, granting William the right to a retrial. However, in 2022, a higher court reversed this decision, upholding the original conviction. As for William's potential involvement in other crimes, there is still no clarity. He had previous convictions for minor and medium offenses, but had never been charged with murder. Investigators still believe William may be linked to other unsolved cases, because the murder of Tanya and Jay did not seem like the work of an amateur. The way he executed the crime and evaded justice for decades indicated he might have killed before. But we...
Man, told y'all I was gonna finish that. We did it. It took us a little bit. I'm gonna start streaming more too, y'all. Instead of doing an hour, we're probably gonna do like an hour and 30 minutes. And the more and more, y'all get tuned in, the more and more I'll start going more. But hey, I appreciate y'all, family. I'm gonna have to hit the hay. And I know you do too. But remember, what y'all learned today? What tonight? Don't leave your kids alone. If you're a parent out there, please watch your kids. Don't just push them to the side. Go play outside by themselves in public. Bro, just pay attention. Good night, y'all. We out there, motherfucker.